This video will cover beginner part 1 questions regarding the topic of derivatives trigonometric functions. Here are the basic differentiation formulas for 6 trigonometric functions. It's much better to remember that only functions starting with a C have a negative sign. First, let's see why these formulas came out. I will prove it from sin x. Let f of x equals sin x. Do you remember the definition of the derivative? F prime of x equals limit as h approaches 0, f of x plus h minus f of x over h equals limit as h approaches 0, sin x plus h minus sin x over h. Use the formula sin a plus b equals sin a times cosine b plus cosine a times sin b. So limit as h approaches 0, sin x times cosine h plus cosine x times sin h minus sin x over h. With these two terms, take out common factor which is sine, limit as h approaches 0, sin x times cosine h minus 1 plus cosine x times sin h over h. We can rewrite it with h as a variable, which means x is a constant. So limit as h approaches 0, sin x times cosine h minus 1 over h plus limit as h approaches 0, cosine x sin h over h. Then we can rewrite as the constant times the limit of the function. So sin x times limit as h approaches 0, cosine h minus 1 over h plus cosine x times limit as h approaches 0, sin h over h. Then sin x times, please remember, limit as x approaches 0, 1 minus cosine x over x equals 0. So this one equals 0 plus cosine x times limit x approaches 0, sin x over x equals 1. So this part equals 1. Then cancelled. The answer is cosine x. Now we know sin x prime equals cosine x. Remember, when you run the chain rule, everything is the same. The only difference is that it was trigonometric functions. It would be simple and nice if there was just x. Why is there more, like a 3x, x squared, or square root of x? You can think of it as u. So number 1, we can rewrite as y equals sine bracket 3x. Think of it as y equals sine u, then dy dx equals cosine u times u prime. Keep the inner function. So y prime equals cosine u times u prime. Keep the inner function, which is 3x. Then cosine 3x times derivative of 3x equals 3. The final answer is 3 cosine 3x. Number 2, we can rewrite as y equals sine x squared. Think of it as u, then y prime equals cosine u times u prime. Then inner function is x squared. Then cosine x squared times x squared prime equals 2x. We can rewrite as 2x cosine x squared. Number 3, we can rewrite as y equals sine x squared. This might be better and more simple. That means u equals sine x. So you can think of it as y equals u squared. Then dy dx equals 2u times u prime. So y equals u squared. Then y prime equals 2u times u prime. Keep the inner function, which is sine x. Then 2 times sine x times sine x prime equals cosine x. And it can be rewritten as sine 2x. Number 4, think x plus 3 is u. The y equals sine u, then y prime equals cosine u times u prime. The inner function is x plus 3. So cosine x plus 3 times x plus 3 prime equals 1. The final answer is cosine x plus 3. Number 5, we can rewrite as y equals sine square root of x. Then this is u part. So y prime equals cosine u times u prime. The inner function is square root of x. This is cosine square root of x times power form x to the power of 1 over 2 prime. Then x to the power of 1 over 2 prime equals 1 over 2 x to the power of 1 over 2 minus 1. Then 1 over 2 times x to the power of minus 1 over 2. 1 over 2 times 1 over square root of x. Then back to the original. Cosine square root of x times 1 over 2 square root of x, or cosine square root of x over 2 square root of x. Number 6, we can rewrite as y equals sine x to the power of 1 over 2. Think of it as y equals u to the power of 1 over 2. Then y prime equals 1 over 2 u to the power of 1 over 2 minus 1 times u prime. The inner function is sine x. Then 1 over 2 times sine x to the power of minus 1 over 2 times sine x prime equals cosine x. Then back to the radical form. 1 over 2 times 1 over square root of sine x times cosine x. The final answer is cosine x over 2 square root of sine x. Shall we prove cosine x now? Let f of x equals cosine x. Then f prime of x equals limit as h approaches 0, cosine x plus h minus cosine x over h equals limit as h approaches 0, cosine a plus b equals cosine a times cosine b minus sine a times sine b. So cosine x times cosine h minus sine x times sine h minus cosine x over h. Then with these two terms, limit as h approaches 0, take out the common factor, which is cosine x times cosine h minus 1 minus sine x sine h over h. Then we can separate limit as h approaches 0, cosine x times cosine h minus 1 over h minus limit as h approaches 0, sine x times sine h over h. We can rewrite as cosine x times limit h approaches 0, cosine h minus 1 over h minus sine x times limit as h approaches 0, sine h over h equals cosine x times 0 minus sine x times 1 cancelled. The final answer is minus sine x. Now we know cosine x prime equals sine x. Let's do question 7. We can rewrite as y equals cosine 1 over 2x. Since y equals cosine u, then y prime equals minus sine u times u prime. The inner function is 1 over 2x. So minus sine 1 over 2x times 1 over 2x prime equals just 1 over 2. Final answer is minus 1 over 2 sine 1 over 2x. Number 8, just think of it as y equals cosine u, then y prime equals minus sine u times u prime. The u is minus x. Then minus sine minus x times minus x prime equals minus 1. The final answer is sine minus x. Number 9, just think of it as y equals cosine u. The y prime equals minus sine u times u prime. The inner function is 4x cubed, like this. And then minus sine 4x cubed times 4x cubed prime equals 12x squared. The final answer is minus 12x squared sine 4x cubed. Number 10, we can rewrite as y equals cosine x to the power of 1 over 3. Then think of it, y equals u to the power of 1 over 3. Then dy dx equals 1 over 3 u to the power of minus 2 over 3 times u prime. So y prime equals 1 over 3 times u to the power of minus 2 over 3 times u prime. To keep the inner function, which is cosine x. Then back to the radical form, 1 over 3 times 1 over cube root of cosine squared x times cosine x prime equals minus sine x. The final answer is minus sine x over 3 times cube root cosine squared x. Number 11, we can rewrite as y equals cosine x cubed. Just think of it as u cubed. So y prime equals 3u squared times u prime. U is cosine x. Then 3 times cosine squared x times cosine x prime equals minus sine x. The final answer is minus 3 cosine squared x times sine x. Number 12, we can use the product rule. F times g prime equals f prime g plus fg prime. So y prime equals sine x prime times cosine x plus sine x times cosine x prime. Sine prime equals cosine x times cosine x plus sine x times cosine x prime equals minus sine x. Then cosine squared x minus sine squared x, which is cosine 2x. Or we can rewrite as times 2 divided by 2. Then this part is sine 2x. So y equals 1 over 2 sine 2x. Then only this part equals u. So y prime equals, keep the constant, and cosine u times u prime. The inner function is 2x. Then 1 over 2 times cosine 2x times 2x prime equals 2. Cancelled. The final answer is cosine 2x. Shall we prove tangent x now? We can rewrite as f of x equals sine x over cosine x. Then use the quotient rule. U over v prime equals u prime v minus u v prime over v squared. So f prime of x equals sine x prime times cosine x minus sine x times cosine x prime over cosine x squared. Then sine x prime equals cosine x times cosine x minus sine x times cosine x prime equals minus sine x over cosine x squared equals cosine squared x make positive plus sine squared x over cosine squared x equals 1 over cosine squared x, which is secant squared x. Now we know tangent x prime equals secant squared x. Then number 13, only this part equals u, so y equals tangent to u. Then y prime equals secant squared u times u prime. The inner function is minus x over 3. Then secant squared minus x over 3 times minus x over 3 prime equals minus 1 over 3. The final answer is minus 1 over 3 secant squared minus x over 3. Number 14, think of it as y equals tangent u, y prime equals secant squared u times u prime. The inner function is 1 over x. Then secant squared 1 over x times 1 over x prime equals x to the power of minus 1 prime. Then use the power rule, minus x to the power of minus 2, then back to the fraction form, 1 over x squared minus 1 over x squared. The final answer is minus 1 over x squared times secant squared 1 over x. Number 15, use the product rule. Fg prime equals f prime g plus f g prime. Then y prime equals x squared prime times tangent x plus x squared times tangent x prime. X squared prime equals 2x tangent x plus x squared times tangent x prime equals secant squared x. Number 16, we can rewrite as y equals tangent 9x squared. Just think of it, y equals tangent u, then y prime equals secant u times u prime. Inner function is 9x squared equals secant squared 9x squared times 9x squared prime is 18x. The final answer is 18x times secant squared 9x squared. Number 17, we can rewrite as y equals tangent x cubed. Then just think of it, y equals u cubed. Then y prime equals 3u squared times u prime. Y prime equals 3u squared times u prime. The inner function is tangent x. Then 3 times tangent squared x times tangent prime equals secant squared x. This is the last one. Just think of it, y equals tangent u, then y prime equals secant squared u times u prime. The inner function is sine x. Then secant squared sine x times sine x prime equals cosine x. I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in a comment below, and I will address them in a future video. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more.